We've been exploring the grand narratives of world history, the big stories people tell about the past. But how did those stories get written? Who decided what was important, and how should it be told? That brings us to the heart of 19th century historiography, and right into the firestorm of ideas surrounding one of its most passionate figures, Jules Michelet. Now, let's set the stage. We're talking about the early 19th century. Thinkers like Hegel were wrestling with deep questions about history's meaning, trying to figure out its unique place in human understanding. But while he was pondering these lofty things, something was happening on the ground. History became a job. Suddenly you had dedicated professors, specialized societies, journals popping up everywhere, Berlin, Paris, across Europe. It was becoming a proper academic discipline. This professionalization felt like a big deal, a sign that history had finally arrived as a serious field. But here's the kicker. Unlike physics or chemistry, which underwent massive conceptual shifts during their professionalization, history didn't really have that kind of revolution. The fundamental why of historical study remained surprisingly fuzzy, even as the profession grew more structured. So, what did this new historical profession actually do? Their training often boiled down to two main things. First, mastering the nitty-gritty details of old documents using fancy philological techniques. Second, learning a whole list of don'ts basically. Don't try to make grand philosophical claims, don't mix it with religion, stick to the facts. This was partly a reaction against the earlier philosophy of history guys, who in their eyes had gone off the rails by mixing metaphysics and faith into their work. So they declared history must be something else, a blend of science and art. But what kind of science? Not the rigorous law-finding stuff of physics. More like Baconian empiricism, just observe, collect data, describe what happened. And what kind of art? Not the free, creative, romantic stuff. Just lively storytelling, maybe even entertaining, but strictly using traditional techniques, no flights of fancy allowed. The idea was to create a neutral zone, a bridge between the hard sciences and the arts, supposedly serving the greater good of society. But hold on, this call for neutrality wasn't quite as innocent as it sounded. By mid-century, there were already two camps. Some saw history just as another way to comment on current politics, while others thought it could comment on everything ever. The big journals, like the Revue Historique and the Historische Zeitschrift, jumped on the neutrality bandwagon. They talked about methodological rigidity and avoiding partisanship. Sounds objective, right? Except they didn't define what that meant. And guess what? It conveniently excluded certain viewpoints. As the preface to the Historische Zeitschrift made clear, they were actively pushing out perspectives labeled feudalism, radicalism, ultramontanism, basically anything that smacked of strong political or social challenge. What they were really doing was disciplining history to serve the interests of the newly established middle classes, the conservatives and liberals who had come to power after the revolution. And if you were on the left, forget about it. Thinkers like Victor Cousin and François Guizot got fired from the Sorbonne for teaching ideas instead of just facts. Feuerbach and Strauss faced roadblocks in Germany. Later, Michelet himself, along with Quinet and Mickiewicz, lost their jobs. History wasn't just neutral, it was becoming a political tool. And who better to see through this charade than Heinrich Heine, the poet revolutionary, writing from exile? He wasn't subtle. He called out the historians, the professors, the whole academic humanist crowd. He accused them of being creepers and intriguers, hiding their support for oppressive regimes behind a mask of detached objectivity. They were cultivating a convenient, soothing fatalism, he said, basically telling people to just accept the past and stop worrying about changing the present. He even threw the romantic poets under the bus. While historians looked backwards, poets looked forwards, promising happiness in some distant future, making the present seem meaningless. Both, Heine argued, failed to value life itself. Life isn't just a stepping stone to something else, nor is it just a memory of the past. Life is a right, and the only way to validate that right, to justify life against death and despair, is through revolution. Heine was basically saying, wake up. Stop being passive. The present struggle matters. This critique would echo later, especially with Nietzsche's famous attack on academic historiography. Okay, amidst all this political maneuvering and philosophical debate, some towering figures emerged. Between 1821 and 1868, we saw the publication of works that are still considered benchmarks today. Four names stand out: Jules Michelet, the fiery champion of Romantic history; Leopold von Ranke, the meticulous founder of the historical school, the model for academic rigor; Alexis de Tocqueville, the insightful observer of democracy and society; and Jacob Burckhardt, the master of cultural history, painting vivid portraits of civilizations. Just look at their output: Ranke's Histories, Michelet's epic French Revolution, Tocqueville's Democracy in America, Burckhardt's Renaissance. These aren't just books, they represent different ways of thinking about how to grasp the past. While many other great historians existed, these four became the archetypes, the models for what modern historical consciousness could look like. Let's dig into a core tension highlighted by Hegel and carried forward. Hegel tried to draw a line. Historiography is just writing history, but philosophy of history is the deeper game, figuring out the grand principles, the universal story. He thought only philosophers should attempt that. But most historians in the 19th century, they didn't get it. For them, philosophy of history was bad history, using your pre-existing ideas to force fit facts into a mold. The right way, the historical method, was to go into the archives completely blank, find the documents, and then tell the story that those documents naturally suggested. The explanation would emerge organically from the narrative. The idea was that the meaning would be there, like the structure revealed by a map's legend. You just needed to tell the story accurately, and the explanation would be in the periphery, almost an afterthought. But here's where it gets tricky. If you read these master historians, you'll notice their histories aren't just random collections of facts. They have incredible formal coherence, a powerful conceptual grip on the subject matter. Even Burckhardt, who seemed most committed to letting facts speak for themselves, crafted impressionistic histories with a distinct satirical edge. So, where does this explanatory power come from if not explicit argument? The answer lies in how they employed the material. Their historism wasn't just about careful description, it was fundamentally about explanation by implotment. When Ranke said he was just telling what actually happened, he was actually framing it as a drama or comedy. When Michelet wrote of resurrection, he was imploding history as a spiritual rebirth. Tocqueville analyzed society, imploding it as a complex system. Burckhardt painted cultures, imploding them aesthetically. Their philosophies weren't just in their arguments. They were embedded in the very stories they chose to tell. So we need to look deeper than just the type of story they told. What really differentiated Michelet, Ranke, Tocqueville, and Burckhardt? It was a combination of three things. First, their underlying ideological stance towards the historical field. Think of it as their political leanings, though none were radicals: anarchist, conservative, liberal, reactionary. Second, the linguistic protocol they used to describe history, how they talked about it metaphorically, synecdochically, metonymically, ironically. And third, the mode of implotment, the overarching story form they adopted. So we can see Michelet as romantic historiography, as realism in the metaphorical mode; Ranke as historicism in the metonymical mode; Tocqueville as social history in the synecdochic mode; and Burckhardt as cultural history in the ironic mode. They all shared a rejection of rigid systems and a focus on employment over argument, but their fundamental outlooks and linguistic tools set them apart. Let's zoom in on Michelet and the romantic approach. How did they try to escape the perceived dead end of irony, the sense of meaninglessness that haunted thinkers like Constant? They turned back to metaphor. Instead of trying to fit history into neat organic systems like Herder had attempted, the Romantics, especially Michelet, used metaphor to capture the essence of historical processes. They believed they could achieve explanatory power by describing the historical field through rich metaphors and representing its dynamics using the mythos of romance. Think epic struggles, dramatic transformations. This was a return to a more intuitive, less systematic way of understanding history, aiming to evoke a sense of lived experience rather than abstract theory. To understand the Romantic impulse, we need to look at the mood they were reacting against. Thinkers like Benjamin Constant captured this perfectly. He described the historical world as a chaos of being. Victory feels hollow, humanity stands alone on an empty earth. Generations come and go, isolated, suffering, dying without leaving a trace. The past offers no wisdom, the future holds no promise. Man is abandoned without memory, without hope. All the old structures of belief have crumbled, leaving individuals adrift with their own inadequate powers. It's a profoundly ironic and nihilistic view. Consciousness is overwhelmed by reality, unable to make sense of it or control it. This was the abyss the Romantics felt compelled to leap over. How did they respond to this darkness? One path was mystical affirmation, exemplified by Friedrich Novalis. Facing the same despair, Novalis didn't deny the chaos. He embraced it as part of a larger redemptive process. He argued that secular solutions were weak. We needed a higher yearning, a connection to the universe. He looked to history itself for clues, believing in an instructive coherency and a magic wand of analogy that could reveal the spirit of the age. Salvation wasn't in returning to old dogmas or creating new ones, but in having faith in history's inherent spirit, following its hints and promises. It's a complete reversal of Constant's despair. Where Constant saw meaninglessness, Novalis saw potential redemption through faith in history's unfolding. Interestingly, both positions, the skeptical void and the mystical plenum, lead to a similar historiography where every event gains significance simply by being part of the grand narrative. Then there's Thomas Carlyle, who took a more activist turn. His goal wasn't just to understand the chaos, but to fight against it. He wanted to revoke the edict of destiny, to give voice to the great dead, to inspire the living. He saw history as a palingenesis, a bringing back to life of greatness. Like Novalis, he viewed the past as a chaos of being, a constant flux where everything influences everything else. But unlike Novalis, Carlyle believed the historian could navigate this chaos by combining scientific observation of patterns with poetic appreciation of individual uniqueness. His critical principle: find the hero, the exceptional individual who imposes will upon the indolent mob. This gave history a sense of agency, releasing it from pure determinism. However, it also meant Carlyle stopped short of providing a comprehensive explanation of the whole process. He was more interested in celebrating the heroic struggle itself, offering inspiration rather than a neat theoretical account. Now entered Jules Michelet. He positioned himself differently within Romanticism. He claimed he'd found a scientific method within the Romantic sensibility, something more rigorous. He even denied being a Romantic, saying he'd been busy in the archives while the movement was happening. His secret weapon? Concentration and reverberation. This sounds mystical, but think of it as a way to intensely focus on the past, using his poetic intuition critically to fuse knowledge and thought, melting down apparent diversities to reveal the underlying unity. It's essentially taking the metaphorical mode and running with it, rejecting both simplistic causal chains and typological categories. For Michelet, the key insight was essential sameness. Individual uniqueness was real, but ultimately derived from the unity everything strives towards. He sought symbolic fusion, seeing the whole in the parts, not just individual symbols within a larger system. This focus on unity as a goal, not just a description, had huge implications for Michelet. First, the historian's job wasn't just to record, but to actively promote the realization of this ultimate unity. Second, everything in history had to be judged based on whether it helped or hindered this goal. So how did he narrate this striving towards unity? Through romance. He framed history as a dramatic battle between essential virtue and virulent, temporary vice. Think of it as a dualistic struggle: tyranny versus justice, hate versus love. There's no slow, incremental progress here. It's more like waves of conflict, punctuated by moments of near unity, like the first year of the French Revolution, which Michelet saw as a glimpse of perfection. The ultimate aim? To discover the metaphor of metaphors, the unifying symbol that encompasses everything, whether conceived as nature, God, history, or humanity. Let's see this in action with Michelet's History of the French Revolution. He describes the revolutionary spirit not as a political event, but as a spiritual awakening. It starts as light emerging from darkness. Then it's the triumph of natural fraternity over the artificial divisions of the old regime. Finally, it reaches a state of pure symbolization. This symbol for man is man. He paints a picture of a universal church, not built by men, but spontaneously arising from the people's shared emotion. It's the greatest diversity in the most perfect unity. His entire conception of his task was resurrection, bringing back to life this ideal moment, preserving it against the inevitable decay and forgetfulness that follows. But Michelet's optimism couldn't last forever. As the ideals of the revolution faded and reaction set in, his tone inevitably turned melancholic. Writing under the July monarchy, then facing Napoleon III, he couldn't help but see the recurring pattern of oppression. His Précis d'Histoire Moderne ends just before the revolution, depicting a society in decay. High society plays sentimental comedies, while the public voice grows bitter. Philosophy is sick, trapped between skepticism and nihilism. It's a comic sadness, a profound impotence. Everyone promises and cannot do anything. And what breaks this deadlock? The revolution itself, characterized as the tardy reaction of justice against the government of favor. It's a necessary violent reversal, but Michelet increasingly saw it as a fleeting moment of truth in a world doomed to repeat its errors. Michelet often used the image of a mountain erupting to describe the revolution, a violent forced birth. This image resonated deeply because he saw his own time as another such eruption of injustice. The forces of tyranny kept returning, crushing the hopes of the past. This led him to a darker realization, the eternal return of evil and division. Yet he refused to succumb to despair. He transformed this recognition of futility into a precondition for hope. Just as the people on the eve of the revolution were told, "Be not alarmed by thy doubt. That doubt is already faith. Believe hope." Despite the setbacks, the underlying romantic plot remained. Tragedy and irony were just phases, temporary states that would eventually be overcome by the fire of revolution, which Michelet saw as his own mission to keep alive through his writing. So, what was Michelet's ultimate purpose? It wasn't just about entertaining readers or proving a theory. It was about bearing true witness against those who flatter kings and priests, drowning false history. The Bastille for him symbolized the tyranny of selective memory, the deliberate forgetting of inconvenient truths. The worst crime, he believed, wasn't murder, but eternal oblivion. But Michelet insisted that nothing is truly forgotten. The historian's sacred duty is to remember the living dead, to relive their struggles, to enter their prison of memory. In his introduction to the history of the French Revolution, he addresses God directly. "As thou art justice, thou wilt support me. For whom then have I written this, but for thee, eternal justice?" He positions himself as a redeemer, restoring the silenced voices to a second life. Now let's compare Michelet to his German counterpart, Leopold von Ranke, the paragon of objectivity. On the surface, they seem worlds apart. Michelet is passionate, biased for the people and revolution. Ranke claims to be utterly impartial, detached. But dig deeper, and the similarities are striking. Both saw themselves as guardians of historical memory, fighting against tyranny and falsehood. Both believed in the possibility of truthful representation. Ranke's objectivity wasn't absolute detachment. It was governed by his own preferences and biases, just like Michelet's, but Michelet wore his heart on his sleeve, while Ranke hid his behind a veil of scientific neutrality. Both were fighting for the right to tell the story truthfully, even if they defined truth differently. Michelet's view of the historian's role becomes even more profound when he speaks of writing for the dead. He uses two powerful images. First, the Oedipus. The historian must solve the riddle of the past, explain the meaning of actions that seemed obscure at the time. Second, Prometheus. The historian brings fire to melt the ice, thawing frozen voices so they can speak again, even hearing the silences of history. The goal isn't just to inform the living. It's to restore the dead to a second life, to allow them to comprehend their fate and rest peacefully. History then becomes a sacred trust, carrying the ashes of the forgotten with piety and tender care. Michelet found a crucial theoretical ally in Giambattista Vico. Vico offered a secular way to understand history as a providential process, driven by an intelligence greater than man without resorting to divine intervention. Michelet adopted this idea, seeing society's revolutions as finding the elements of redemption precisely in the corruption of the previous era. Society, Michelet concluded, is indeed made by humans, but it operates according to a wisdom often contrary and always superior to our specific aims. Even when nations try to destroy themselves, he believed, the phoenix of society is reborn from the ashes. This cyclical, almost mystical view of history, rooted in Vico, provided Michelet with the framework to believe in an ultimate triumph of justice, even amidst apparent setbacks. Comparing Michelet to Johann Gottfried Herder highlights another key difference. Herder, using metaphor and synecdoche, saw history as a gradual organic growth, accepting everything and praising anything simply for existing. Michelet, starting with the same metaphorical awareness, but infused with his ironic perspective on the transience of historical forms, took a different path. He recognized conflict, took sides, judging forces as good or evil. His ideal wasn't organic growth but anarchy, a spontaneous natural unity free from artificial structures like states or nations. This made him fundamentally critical, unable to praise anything except the fleeting moment of pure conjunction he saw in the revolution's early days. He could celebrate the heroes of that ideal, but the ideal itself remained ethereal, never fully realized in time, always slipping away like the anarchist state it presupposed. So, where does this leave us with Michelet? He represents a fascinating synthesis, blending the passionate intensity of Romanticism with a drive for historical understanding. His method, grounded in metaphor and romance, created narratives that were not just informative but deeply moving, capturing the spirit of an age. His legacy lies in showing the power of narrative, the importance of emotion and memory in historical work, and the enduring challenge of grappling with the ideals of the past against the complexities of the present. His work continues to provoke thought about how we remember, interpret, and strive to understand our collective past.